What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a bait shop, or a fishing dock. I wasn't really sure what to call this one. Originally I was actually going to call it a boathouse, and then I realized there was no boats, so that wouldn't really work. We're just going to go with a bait shop. I feel like it's been a while since we've created some sort of building on this channel, so that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this week's video. So first thing to do was gather reference, and while looking around online, I came across some pictures of miniatures people have made of old fishing docks. I really love the look of these images, and I thought it'd be a lot of fun to recreate one of my own, and take some of the ideas from these and incorporate them into my own model. Now, I really didn't know exactly how I wanted it to look. I had a rough idea from these reference images I found, but the more I looked around, the more ideas I wanted to add to the model, and it was really challenging trying to limit the amount of objects I wanted to fit into the scene because I only had about a day to model it. So we will have to experiment a little bit to see what works and try to keep the objects fairly simple. I didn't want to add too much detail. For example, I originally wanted to add a bunch of fishing poles and other fishing equipment, but because things were taking so long, I decided to make a lot of the objects a bit more simple and straightforward, like barrels and wood planks. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this model took a lot longer than expected, and a big reason for that was all of the UVs. There's so many small objects, and sometimes I underestimate how long UVing can take. But there are actually a lot of things you can do to make the whole UV mapping process a lot easier, and also just save yourself a lot of time. And we will go over that as well later on in the video. That's also why this week's video is just gonna be a time-lapse speed modeling type of video, because I simply ran out of time, but I promise there will be more fully narrated videos coming soon. Now, usually when I model and I'm not recording myself, I will UV along the way. So I'll model an object, I'll UV it, and then I can duplicate it. But in a lot of these YouTube videos, I don't really do that. I do the 3D modeling first and then the UVs after. And the big reason why I do that is just so it's easier for others to follow along and we're not just jumping around all over the place. However, if you're going to be recreating this model, I would highly recommend you UV along the way. Since we're duplicating a lot of these objects like wood planks and poles, it would have saved me a ton of time UVing them first before duplicating them all over the place. And we'll go over that more in detail later on in the video. Now, as always, this video will be available in real time, along with all the working files. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, it will all be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. Also, if you enjoy these types of videos and you want to see more random 3D models, please consider subscribing to the channel or liking the video. It would really help me out, and I appreciate all of your support. So after finding some references and figuring out exactly what we wanted to create, the first thing to do was to figure out how I wanted the bait shop to look. I decided to use this image as my main reference, so we need to start blocking out the main shapes. I decided to start with the main building first, so I could figure out roughly how big I wanted the whole shop to look, and then we can move on to the dock that wraps around it, and then finally all the small objects and smaller details. Once again, I really didn't know how much detail I wanted to add or how low poly I wanted it to look. So for example, the roof, I was originally planning on just adding a simple plane and adding some roof detail, some bump map into the materials in Substance Painter. But halfway through I changed my mind and decided to add some metal sheets to the roof to add a little bit more detail to it. So this week's model is going to be a bit experimental, but that's also what makes it a lot of fun. As always, it's important to not rush the blockout stage. We need to make sure we're happy with all the main shapes, and then we can start refining them and making them look a little bit more detailed. So let's do that. Let's slowly block out these main shapes, and let's start slowly building up our bait shop.
you.
All right, so here is the bait shop in its finished form. And as you can see, I decided to split this thing up into 4 different groups for the 4 different textures I have applied. Now, obviously it's up to you as an artist, depending on how many textures you want, but textures are heavily impacted in game engines. So I didn't want to go ridiculous with the texture amount, so I wanted to keep it somewhat limited. So I decided to go with 4, but obviously it's really up to you. So let me open the UV editor here and I'll show you how I did these UVs. So on the very first group is the house. So that's just simply the walls and the roof panels. Now, a big reason why I kept this as its own texture was just so I can keep these walls, these UV shells on the walls fairly large. If they were shrunk down a lot smaller, you just have less resolution, and since I was planning to have that siding material, I just wanted that to be nice and detailed so you can see that detail in that material. So I just basically kept the walls and the roof as their own. Another important thing was keeping the orientation of these side UV shells, or all the walls, in the same direction. Now, that's not always needed, but it just made applying materials a lot easier. That way I didn't have some of these walls siding running vertical and others running horizontal. Since they're all the same orientation, applying that material to these walls made it just very easy and quick for me in Substance Painter. And of course, not having any of these UV shells on a slant, since they are straight, either vertically or horizontally, it allowed there to be no, weird warping in those materials, since I was planning to have lines running along these walls. So having them nice and straight was important for the textures I was planning to add to them. So for the second group and texture is basically the wood pieces, so all of the dock and the stairs. Once again, it was really important to make sure that my UV shells were nice and straight. Because I was planning to have wood grain materials, I didn't want the grains to be, horizontal or vertical on some and the opposite on others, and it just wouldn't look realistic. So by having all these wood pieces the same direction, it just made the applying wood materials a lot easier for me. Now, of course, there are some shells like these ones up here that I had to turn horizontally, but I tried to make majority of them all vertical. And the third group is basically all the other objects on the house. So the windows, the other siding pieces, and all the wood pieces and the doors. And also these large signs. So there's a few important things. One, all of these windows, let me grab the windows. They're all overlapping just to save space. Since there's no windows that are directly beside each other, you wouldn't really see many repeating patterns, and it just saved me a lot of space on my UV map for other objects. Another important thing was making sure that the textile density on these signs were fairly large. Since I was planning to add text and an image to them, I didn't want them to be really low and shrunk down in my UV editor. It would just result in a lot of low resolution when it came to the words, and it would look fuzzy and blurry, and you wouldn't be able to see that detail. So I made sure to increase these a little bit larger so I can, once again, get more resolution in those materials. And the last group is everything else, so all the small objects in my scene. Once again, all these lampposts, for example, are overlapping, so they're sharing the same UV space. And I made the net quite large since I was planning to have that net material. I didn't want it to be blurry, so I wanted more resolution in these as well. Now, one thing I did do last minute, while I was actually texturing the objects, originally all these barrels were overlapping and sharing the same UV space, but I ended up seeing just too much consistent wood material throughout all these objects. So I ended up just separating the UV shells that are between these metal pieces, so like these, for example. I grabbed these UV shells and just slid them over to other spots, so not every barrel is actually sharing the same UV space. But everything else is the same. All these tires, they're all sharing the exact same UV space, and it's pretty straightforward. Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned how there's a few things you can do to make the whole UVing process a lot easier for yourself. And there's things you can do to just help the whole UV process. And I'll show you exactly what I did. So if I go back to, let's say, this dock, When you're creating scenes like this that have lots of the same wood panels, you can see a lot of repeating patterns, and it can quickly look unrealistic and just it's kind of strange if I had like a scratch on this wood panel and it was just repeating on every single wood panel down the dock. So there's ways you can do things to actually have a bit more variation in your materials. Now, of course, I could grab all of these and just lay them out in my UV map. If I had the room to add more materials to this object, instead of just 4 textures, I could have 8 or 9. Of course, you could just lay all these out so they're just individually separated from one another. None of them are overlapping and they would just be unique to one another. You can't always do that since we're limited on texture amounts. And that's something you're going to constantly see as a 3D artist and you're making assets for especially video games. Texture amounts you're really limited by. So there's tricks you can do to actually overlap the same UV shells and have different materials showing. So if you look at these 3 wood panels, for example, up here, they're overlapping each other. They take up a small space on the UV map, but they're all looking different from one another. And how I did that was basically I took one of these wood panels and I flipped it. And then I took another one and I rotated it. So now if there's a scratch happening on this wood panel, well, it would be happening at the back on this one, and it would be happening underneath this wood panel on the opposite side. So now they all look unique to one another, when in reality, they're all sharing the same UV space. So I did that with actually a lot of these objects. So if you look at these poles, for example, some of them are, I have a few poles that are, so for example, these 4 poles, there's 2 different UV shells. So these 2 are sharing the same space and these 2 are. But what I did was I just took a pole and I just slightly rotated it. Or I took, another pole and I rotated this one more. So once again, if there's a scratch happening on this side, it was maybe happening on the back of this pole. And the camera is never going to be able to see all sides at once. So you can fake a lot of that detail by just simply rotating objects around or flipping them. And I did that throughout this whole model, mainly with these wood pieces on the floor. So for example, these ones over here, these 2 are sharing the exact same UV space, but I just took one of these wood panels and I rotated it. So that way you wouldn't see the detail repeating beside each other. So there's lots of tricks you can do to do that, and not only do you have more variation in all of your materials, but you actually save space in your UV map, and it allows you to have more room for other objects. So by doing little tricks like this, you can actually save a lot of space and you can still have more variation in your materials. Another thing that can also help you out is automatic UV. Now, you may have heard me talk about automatic UVs before. I'm not a big fan and I don't use them a lot of times because, in my opinion, it doesn't always do the best job, especially on more complex objects. So I like to use the 3D Cut and Sew UV tool to just make my own cuts. However, in simple low poly objects like this, automatic UV works great, and I used it, to be honest, on a lot of these wood pieces just to save time. So of course, like I said at the beginning of the video, you can just, before duplicating a lot of these, you could just automatic UV 1 and then move those to the side and then start duplicating. That way your UVing is already done and you don't have to worry about coming back and redoing that and then reduplicating it over the same positions, which I had to do in this video, which really dragged on the whole UV mapping process. So using UV or automatic UV it's helpful in some situations, and more so on low poly objects like these. Now that being said, as you can see, I added a small bevel to a lot of these objects. And that's something I also wanted to talk about, because if you're actually using this in a video game, all these small bevels on these little wood pieces is not needed. To be honest with you, you should have 2 meshes if you're creating assets for video games, one lower poly model for in-game and a higher poly model that you can texture on. So for example, on this dock, so what I could do at the very beginning is just, before adding a bevel to it, I could just UV one of these planks, and then I could just go ahead and start duplicating wherever I need them to create my lower poly model. And then I can come through afterwards, duplicate the whole object over, and come through and add bevels to all of these edges. So basically I can create the higher poly one, this beveled edge one, in Substance Painter, so I can have more curvature on these edges for shadows. And it's basically a mesh that I can use to create my texture maps on. And then I can use the lower poly one without any bevels in game, and then use the materials I used on this higher poly mesh on the in-game lower poly mesh. So you may have heard people talk about high and low poly modeling or low and high poly modeling. That's basically what it is, just taking 2 objects, texturing on the higher poly one, and then using the lower poly in game. So I just wanted to make a note that on a lot of these objects, like these little stairs, I added small bevels, and it's not really needed. I just did it because I'm using one mesh. But it's something to keep in mind if you're really going for a lower poly model. You can save tons of polys by just not adding small bevels. Of course, you're gonna get better results. But for example, these roof pieces, I didn't even add a bevel to. They're just hard edged and you don't really notice it. So do what you think is right, but just remember those bevels do add up really quickly. And you'd be surprised how much you can save by just cutting back on bevels. So that's basically how I prepared this bait house for Substance Painter. So all I have to do now is just go ahead and apply different material to each of these groups. That way you'll see 4 different textures in my texture set list in Substance Painter. And then we can export this bait shop. We can jump over to Substance and we can start our texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can load in that FBX file from Maya. Once we bake out those textures, we can go ahead and start applying some materials. Now for this object in particular, I decided to approach it a little bit different than usual. Usually I use a lot of the built-in materials that come with Substance Painter, just so it's easier for others to follow along. But this time I decided to use some materials that were available on the Substance website. Of course, if you're paying for your Substance software, this should be all free and available to you once you log in online. So check out the materials. There is a ridiculous amount of free materials on there. I decided to use a material called painted wood sheathing, and that's just for all of the siding that I used on the main building. And then I also used a rusty painted metal that I used for my roof. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't explore the roof materials too much, and that's probably my least favorite material on this whole model. I feel like I should have spent a bit more time working on that roof, adding a bit more wear and tear, or making the metal kind of blocks looking a bit more crooked. I could have bent them, added a bit more polys to them to make them look a little bit more unique. However, it was quick. I didn't have a lot of time this weekend, so I was still happy with how it turned out, but I did use these 2 downloaded materials for this model. Now, one other thing I was struggling with was choosing how I wanted it to look. Originally, I was focused on that one reference photo, this one, and it was more of a white with blue, and I really liked the look of that. And the more I looked around at other references, I really started looking at other colors, and I was really struggling deciding which color I wanted my building to be. So originally, like I said, I was starting with the light, kind of light blue, white look, and then I decided to switch it to a red building. I saw this reference photo, which was one of the references I was using, and I loved the red look of the building. And I decided to suddenly just switch it to this. And almost near the end of the whole texturing process, I decided to go back to the white look. So if you made it this far in the video and you're watching, please let me know in the comments what color you would have chose. I was really struggling choosing between both, but I decided to go with the white. Now, sometimes, from my experience, you really don't know what looks best until you start applying materials to your objects. So you may have heard me say this in many other videos, but what I like to do is to start filling in a lot of these empty meshes with some sort of material, and then we can start refining them and changing them once they're all filled in. Sometimes you think a material or an object looks good one certain way, and then once you start texturing the objects around it, suddenly that object you thought looked right looks a little bit off. So rather than dialing in one texture perfect right off the bat, in most cases you'll have to come back to it anyways. So I don't like to waste a lot of time trying to figure out what looks best right away. Just fill in those empty meshes. It starts giving you a better idea of how things are looking, and then you can start refining things or changing materials, just like I did with the colors of my building. Now, another thing obviously was those logos or those big billboard signs on my walls. So to do that, I just jumped on Google Images and found a generic bait store label that was free to use. And I decided to throw that into Photoshop and add polys above it just to make it more unique to this channel. So it turned into a polys bait shop. So there's lots of available images you can use online to customize to make them unique to your own models. And I find by doing that, it really helps bring your models to life and gives it a little bit of a history of who uses it and who owns it and how it's used. So if you can add some sort of personal element to all of your models, I highly recommend you do that. I find a model like this, because it's, you know, close to the seaside, it probably gets lots of dirt and grime from people coming through and just the ocean environment. So I wanted to add a lot of dirt and grunge and grime to it. So once we fill in these meshes with materials and we start figuring out the colors we want to use, then we can start adding other fill layers and adding a little bit of dirt on top of it. So that's exactly what you're going to see me do here. I'm just going to fill in these white meshes with materials, and then we can add a little bit of detail and start having a bit more fun with those textures. Don't forget, if you're interested in seeing this full process in real time, it will be available on my Patreon page, along with all the working files. So if you want to open up my Substance file and see how I structured these textures, it's all available for you to see, and it's all available on my Patreon page. I apologize in advance, I did not have time to clean up the layers and name every folder, so just apologize in advance for that one, but it's all there for you to see if you're interested. All right, enough of me talking and dragging this on. Let's start texturing our bait shop. Alright, and that is everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this bait shop. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing to the channel or hitting that like button. And don't forget, this whole video will also be available on my Patreon page in real time, along with all the working files like the FBX and the Substance Painter file. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, you can find it on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. Also, I just want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreons. You all are amazing and you're the true legends of this channel. You really do help keep these videos coming. So I just want to give a special shout out and a thank you to all of you for your continuous support. And don't forget, I'm actually really curious what you guys think between the white building and the red building I was originally texturing. Which one you would have chosen and which one you think looks better. I don't know if I made the mistake by coming back to a white building rather than keeping it in the red, or vice versa, so let me know what you think in the comments below. Alright, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's video, and I will catch you all in the next one.